Now I'm happy to introduce Mr. Stephen Sunshine. He will be speaking on optimizing commercial success. Stephen is a transition consultant for commercialization at the Foundation for Enterprise Development, and he is an entrepreneur who has founded and led a wide variety of technology companies. Stephen is currently the CEO of TixTrack Inc., a company that provides pricing analytics to the sports and entertainment industry. And prior to founding TixTrack, Dr. Sunshine was CEO of Cyrano Sciences, a chemical and radiological sensor company. Again, you can read his full biography in the information that was provided. Now I'd like to turn the webinar over to Stephen.
Thank you, June. Hopefully everybody can hear me well. What I'd like to do is spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about this process of migrating from the DoD space or the defense space to the commercial space. So on the first slide, I'd like to pose this dilemma, which is most of the people, all the people on the phone have been developing technology through the DARPA, SBIR, and STTR programs. Many of you technology which has potential dual use, and the real question is there the ability to commercialize that technology in the commercial space? And as we heard in the previous talk, not all technology is going to be amenable to commercial success. So on the next slide, what I'm going to try to do today is to define a process that you can walk through, you can go through, in order to decide or determine if any of the ideas you have about a commercially viable technology can in fact be successful. So what we're going to do is define a process that can be applied, and I'm going to walk you through that process today. And really it's the process of converting ideas into business concepts, and then business concepts, validating and vetting those business concepts to determine whether or not they really can be commercially successful. And in the process, the nice thing about this process is that you will develop the key material that's required for both a business plan and for an investor pitch. So it's a rigorous process that allows you to walk through this question in a rational way. So on the next slide, we're going to start with ideas, really just about anything that came to your mind. I'm sure everybody sits around thinking about their technology and how their technology might be applied outside of the core space that they're being funded by DARPA. The first step in this transition is to take those ideas and turn them into what I call into a concept statement. So a concept statement is a one-pager describing the commercial business opportunity. And then once you get to that stage, the next step will be a feasibility analysis to determine which of these concepts, and you can definitely start with more than one concept, actually has the potential to be a viable commercial business. And hopefully through this feasibility analysis, you'll be generating the key elements of both the business plan and the pitch. So on the next slide, I've got a schematic of what this looks like. So the key is, I think of it as a funnel, a feasibility funnel. We're going to start with lots of ideas, mostly because it's oftentimes very challenging at the very beginning to figure out which of those ideas are truly commercially viable. So we're going to start with a number of ideas, and then we're going to put them through this process. And the process is going to convert these ideas and effectively eliminate ideas and also build out ideas so that at the end we have what comes out of the bottom, a successful product or venture, if there is one. And a perfectly acceptable answer is that of all these ideas that were postulated, none of them really are going to stand the test of whether or not they can be a standalone product or venture in the commercial space. And really that's as important an answer as determining that one could be successful, because one of the things you don't want to do is spend lots of time and money working on an idea and ultimately a potential venture that does not succeed. So hopefully by applying this process, we can eliminate ideas that are not going to be successful and then concentrate on the ones that have the highest potential. So on the next slide, we're going to start through this process with the business idea. And as I said, I think most people who are in the technology space, who are working actively in an area and think about what could be outside of the DoD space, think about dual use, have probably thought of an initial idea or a concept. And I think, kind of echoing what David said, one of the key elements here is that for an idea to be a success, you really have to be able to identify a pain in an industry, and ideally this should be an industry where you have some knowledge and interest. And obviously the larger the pain, the more likely that the market will exist and the market will be sizable. Important thing at the very beginning of this process is that more ideas are better. So it's a good idea to use brainstorming or other means to develop as many business ideas as possible. Because really at this stage, no idea is a bad idea. We're going to go through the feasibility process in order to eliminate the bad ideas. So on the next slide, I'm going to start with an example of an idea. And it sounds like, well, an idea, how hard can that be? But I think what you'll see through this talk is that there is the general idea of a business, and then there's the business concept, and then ultimately there's the full feasibility analysis. So if we take Apple Computer as an example, at the very outset of Apple Computer, they had a simple idea, which was to create a computer that was simple enough to use that a non-technical person could enter the computer age. So this is an idea, but in reality it doesn't really have that much meat around it in terms of how you're going to deliver on this idea. So that takes us to the next step, which is on the next slide, which is this idea of a business concept. So we need to transition from this kind of high-level idea of a potential need to a business concept. And the big jump that happens between the idea and the business concept is the clear identification of the customer, a means of reaching that customer, and the exact benefit that you plan to deliver. So while the idea may address a certain pain or desire that you recognize that's out there, the business concept takes that one step further and defines the customer, how you're going to get your product to that customer, and the benefit that you're delivering to that customer. So on the next slide, we talk about the core elements of what is in the concept statement. So what does the product or service do? So this is the first question you have to ask yourself. I've been toying in the DoD space. I have an idea in the commercial space. What does that product or service do? And how is it different than other products or services that are attempting to provide the same benefit? Who's going to buy it? So who's ultimately the customer? And how are you going to make money? So what is your revenue model? And obviously there's a whole breadth of potential revenue models, from selling direct to the consumer to selling to some second party who's then going to sell to the consumer. And then why would somebody buy it? Is it going to be based on the price that you're offering? So are you going to be competitive on price? Is it convenience? Is it better performance? So you need to really understand what is your competitive advantage in terms of your product. And then finally, where are you going to sell it? Is it geographically limited? Is it worldwide? So these are the concepts that you want to get across in this first business outline or business statement or concept statement that you generate. And on the next slide, I present Apple's first business concept statement. So this was taking this idea of, we want to make computers easier to use and more readily available. And really their first business concept was that they were going to sell a printed circuit board ultimately directed at hobbyists, and that board was going to be sold for $50, and it was going to be populated by parts that the purchaser had to buy separately. And the product was going to be sold through technically oriented hobby shops. So ultimately, Apple would sell the boards to the hobby shop, which would then mark them up and sell them to the consumer. So this was actually the very first product that Apple went to market with, and obviously very different from where they ended up. But you can see it has all the critical elements of a business concept: who they were going to sell to, price, how they were going to make their money. On the next slide, what I want to point out is this was just one potential business idea. They had the business idea of making computers easier to use, but in terms of how to get there, in terms of the business concept, there were lots of choices at this point. The top one is the one I just described, which was they were going to focus on hobbyists, sell through hobby shops, and really the benefit was kind of a cool gadget for people who were in the high-tech world who wanted to be able to dabble in the very early stages of the computer business. At the very bottom, I kind of give the extreme opposite end of the potential business concepts that are available. They could have gone directly to computer manufacturers as the customer and licensed the operating system that they had developed or were developing, and the benefit here would be an improved operating system, which would obviously also open up the computer industry for those who were otherwise not so sophisticated. And you can see a lot of different potential business models, business concepts in between. So, and all of these are perfectly valid. So on the next slide, what I would encourage is that if you're thinking about dual use and the potential for taking your technology into a commercial arena, then the first step is this idea generation. And then the second step would be to create a series, one or more business concepts. Much like the table I showed you on the previous slide, you can do this for your own technology. So think about potential commercial markets, who the customer might be, how you would get to those markets, what the benefit is to the potential end user, and then ask yourself, do any of these concept statements sound compelling? Really, I think it's very easy to be your own best critic at this early stage. You should keep the concept statements that are the strongest, because then we're going to take these concept statements and go one at a time through the actual feasibility analysis. And you should always remember that licensing technology is a very viable and reasonable business concept. And you'll see by the time I get to the end, impact of capital raising and people and size is always very dependent on what kind of business model you pursue. A key element in all of this is to keep track of what you've learned and to take notes, because ultimately it's very important to be able to come back to be able to improve your thought process by keeping on track of what you're doing and taking notes along the way. So if we go back to the next slide, we go back to the concept of this feasibility funnel. We've kind of walked through the first couple of steps, this idea generation, no idea is a bad idea, let's do some brainstorming. Apply some industry knowledge to start turning these into some business concept statements. And now we're going to walk through the actual feasibility analysis. So we hopefully have culled out any idea that didn't hold water, for which we couldn't create a viable business concept statement. And then we've taken the business concept statements, written out this page description, and kind of said, do these make any sense? And now we're going to focus on those ones that we think make sense and apply the feasibility analysis. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about this feasibility analysis. And we're going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail, but bottom line is the first question when approaching this feasibility analysis, the very first thing is there a market? You heard on the previous talk that a large market is one of the critical factors that people are going to look at. So that's the very first test we're going to look at. The next question is, can you actually access the market or the customer? So do you have ability to get to these people? Do you have the right people on your team? So this really gets to the team question, which is probably the number one thing in terms of raising external money, but it's also critical whether or not you raise money that you have the right people in place inside your company that both understand the market and can access the customer. It's also critical that you have sufficient funds. So do you have the right amount of money? And then ultimately the test is it a viable business? And when we get to the viable business, it's really about the economics of that business. So we're going to walk through all of those in the next few minutes here. So on the next slide, we'll jump into the next piece of this, which is really the market opportunity. So this is really the critical first step. If there's really no market, there's no reason to go forward. So the first question is there a real pain or a need? And if so, how large is that need, and is anyone filling that need? So it's very important to understand your industry today, the market segments, who the players are, what your niche is, so how do you play amongst the existing players, or if there are no players, is there a reason why there are no players? What's going on in the market overall, so what are the patterns of change? Are there critical elements that make your idea right for the right time given the changes that are going on? And can you identify the key areas where need exists, and are you filling one of those key areas? So on the next slide, we go into a little bit more detail about how to test some of the assumptions that were in the concept statement originally. So these are really mostly around the customer. So it's very easy to misinterpret who your customer is. I gave the example of Apple Computer. From their idea, you would think that they were focused on a commercial consumer market. They wanted to make computers easier to use, but their very first business concept, their customer was really the hobby shop owner. So it's very easy to kind of misidentify the customer based on your business. So it's very important to test your assumptions about who the real customer is and how that customer fits to your business concept statement, your business model. It's very important to challenge your assumptions. And to define, this all comes into defining the distribution channel. How are you going to sell? Are you selling to the hobby shop, which is obviously a lot less expensive proposition than selling to the end customer? And do you have access to one of those? Is your access to one of those better than the other one? And what's the cost? So obviously it's also a lot less expensive to reach hobby shops than it is the end customer. It's also important to challenge the benefits that you think you're offering through your product. People often get features of a product confused with the benefits of the product. And one of the ways to kind of vet out what you're really selling, what does your product really do, what are the benefits of that product, is to create a brochure. Oftentimes you'll have a product spec, which is really the features of that product, and that will be very different than the benefits of the product. And I can't overemphasize the key, the last point here, which is to identify early customers and early adopters. Because really, all of this hinges on getting that first customer, identifying that first customer, and then having those first customers build the story, help you improve your product, and help you reach the next set of customers. So on the next slide, assuming if everything goes well, the next test is what keeps somebody else from walking into the space that you created and taking it away from you? As a small business, one of the biggest threats are the big companies around you. So the next step is to think about this business and its sustainability. Do you have an intellectual property position? And is that intellectual property position appropriately aligned for the consumer business that you're now looking to enter? Because maybe the intellectual property portfolio was developed for the defense space, so that's a key thing to keep in mind. Is your advantage going to be time to market? Maybe you're one of the first to develop in this particular space. Are there other barriers to entry? Those could be manufacturing setup expense. It could be the fact that you know and have very good relationships with the customer. So are there other barriers to entry? And can you sustain your advantage through product evolution? So these are key areas that could establish a sustainability, but you really need to think through your own business and whether or not your position will be sustainable if you are successful. Once you've kind of built this basis, which is that there's a real market out there, that you really believe that you can access the customer, that you believe that the business is sustainable, then you can go to the next step, which is to worry about the finances. And
Hi,
one way to do this. Yes.
Just wanted to let you know that we'd like you to just wrap up in a couple minutes so we have time for Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next step is the financial is to create financials, and one way to approach this is to create a financial timeline. For a lot of the startup businesses that come out of the DoD space, the model is to go build something that has a certain time associated with it, scaling time, product improvement, cost reduction. It's very important to build a timeline for what it's going to take to get to profitability, because ultimately that whole timeline is really what determines your capital needs and then ultimately the financial viability of the enterprise. So on the next slide, just some outlines of what should go into your financials. Obviously, people tend to focus on revenues, which I think comes out of all the market analysis, but costs are equally important. So it's very important to understand the fully loaded people cost, the cost of goods, what it's going to cost to build a production facility if that's what you need. And it's critical to build a financial model which has very specific success metrics like return on investment or net present value of your enterprise. And it's very important that this analysis be flexible enough that you can run sensitivity analysis to see what happens if your assumptions change. If it takes longer to get to your first customer, what does that do to the viability of your business? So that's really a critical element, but should really only be undertaken after you've defined the business in enough depth that you know that the business can be successful. And on the next slide, I just reiterate what David already said. All businesses really come down to people, and that's why venture capitalists and investors spend so much time looking at the people inside the company. It's important for you as a business owner as well to understand the key rules, who's going to fill them, and what is your role, and are you happy with your role in the company that you're outlining through this business concept approach. Equal to the internal people are the people outside the business, your customers, your financiers. It's important that you really understand all of these people, how they impact your business, and that you have reasonable relationships with all the people in the product chain and in the business chain. So on the next slide, I think the critical element here is that if you go through this process and you have different business concepts, it's important to remember that the business that you're talking about drives the investment and drives the question of whether or not you can build this business on your own, whether you need friends and family money or whether you need venture capital money. Because if you build a business concept that is dependent on large-scale manufacturing build-out, the likely scenario is that's going to require venture capital. If you're talking about a licensing business, then it's very possible that you could do that you could exercise on that business with no investment whatsoever. just remember that the business that you model drives the investment. On the next slide, it really comes down to what's right for you. You can build all these models, but at the end of the day, the critical factor here is the business model has to be one that you want to execute on. It should also have a very high probability of success, but I think given two opportunities, one of which kind of fits you and your personality and one that's less attractive to you, it's always critical to take the opportunity that is most near and dear to your heart. So if we look at the next slide, we go back to Apple Computer and we think about all those concepts that were there initially. You can ask, well, why did Apple Computer end up where they did instead of one of the other myriad of business concepts that they could have pursued? Why did they choose a manufacturing and not a licensing approach as one example? And I think it comes down to the people inside the business. Steve Jobs was a showman. He loved to sell his idea. He had Wozniak as a partner who was a hardware person. They personally had a disdain for other computer makers. So for them, the only choice really was to go and do this themselves. Now, was it the right choice? I think you could argue they gave up the software title to Microsoft in choosing the path they did, and they didn't retain as much of the company as Gates did because they had to raise a lot more money to go into the hardware manufacturing business. But I think it ultimately was the right choice because Steve Jobs loved controlling his destiny. He loved the interface of hardware and software, and because he could put his passion into the business was a success. So on the next slide, hopefully, as you go through this process, you will build all the critical elements that are required for a business plan. They're listed here. I'm not going to go into details, but if you just look at the list here, the market analysis, the description of the management team, the financial analysis, all of these things would naturally come out of this feasibility assessment. And likewise, on the next slide, if you think about the things that an investor would be looking for, the investor pitch, again, these are the same kinds of elements that you should be applying as you go through this feasibility analysis. Which vision, what problem are you solving, which are actual product in your solution, who's the customer, and really, as we heard in the investor pitch, team, who are the people behind it and how are you going to make it work? The kind of details for an investor pitch are listed here, but ultimately you should be answering these questions as you go through this plan. So on the next slide, in summary, first of all, I'd like to reiterate that not all technologies are suitable for commercial markets. And really, a key element here for assessing your opportunities and going through this feasibility analysis is to think about all business possibilities and to remember that there's always a myriad of ways of going to market for any one technology. So it's really important to remember that and to remember, most importantly, that the path you take needs to be one that you are personally happy with and will be happy to execute on. So I'd just like to leave you on the last slide with some additional resources. There are many, many great resources out there. This is just a very small snippet of resources that you can turn to. Obviously, FED is there to support you. And with that, I'd open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate your remarks. And in addition to the resources that Stephen indicated, just wanted to remind people to visit their Small Business Administration, Small Business Development Centers. Those are regionally based. Also any regional economic development organizations or centers in your region, because they have a lot of resources that are specifically applicable to companies that want to go into the commercial space. In terms of some questions for Stephen, we just have a few minutes for those. Stephen, you had mentioned, about people. David mentioned about people on the team. Could you make some comments about boards of directors, how those folks could potentially support companies that are interested in going into the commercial space?
Sure. So, first of all, most companies who are looking at broad application space will obviously have a board, and I'll start by saying one of the controls that's given up when you go and look for money is typically those investors will ask for a board seat. So that's how they actually do have some control over decision making. But I think on the broader question of the board itself, the board is really, I would say, a source of additional ideas, connections to the CEO of the company. And therefore, it's really critical that the board have reach to address some of the issues that I brought up in terms of the expectations for the team. So as an example, as CEO, if you feel like you have a weakness in the in the market space and understanding the players in the market space, then a critical board member would be somebody who is strong in that space, maybe comes out of the industry, has deep connections. So the board is actually a great way to enhance not only your own team, which is important, but to build out on that team and perhaps fill gaps where the core strength of your current team is not as perhaps not as strong as it could be. So, and I would say it's even true of the investors on your board. It's important to appreciate that they're there to help you as well. They will have connections. So, a board is a great resource. Everybody on the board should be there because they want you to succeed, and you can definitely use their talents, their contacts to increase the breadth of the company's footprint.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just we want to just take a couple of minutes for a couple of additional questions. It's been said that the startup CEO is different from the second and third CEO that supports the transition of a company through its various stages. Could you just make some brief comments about what the strengths of each of these CEOs would be, and can they be the same person?
I'll start with the last question. They can definitely be the same person. I think it can be rare. But there are plenty of examples out there where a startup CEO is successful in transitioning and manages the business well past its initial stages. In terms of the differences, I think oftentimes the startup CEO is the person who's willing to push envelopes, to really take huge risk and motivate the people within the organization in a unique way. As the company grows, I think the other challenges raise the fore. So managing the large numbers of people that are underneath you, abilities to delegate, but at the same time exercise control over the larger organization. These are not always talents that are consistent with the entrepreneurial person who starts a company, who literally has their fingers on the pulse of the entire company. And as the company grows, oftentimes that ability, it becomes more challenging to have that same kind of control, not necessarily control, but that same kind of interface to the entire business. So some people just become uncomfortable with that. Some people just don't have the talents. And then oftentimes the business becomes much more a financial business as opposed to a technology business. I think particularly for a lot of technology entrepreneurs, one of the challenges is the big company gets large, it really becomes an issue of more quarterly results, driving financials, turns on inventory, issues which may not be the true passion of that original CEO. So I think that's oftentimes why the entrepreneurial CEO is really best off handing over the reins as the company grows and kind of the challenges become more monthly as opposed to large vision type challenges.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Really appreciated you answering these questions, and we'll go on to the next briefer in a moment.